Back in the summer of 2011, England was absolutely rocked by some of the worst riots anyone had seen in a generation. And once the smoke cleared, a special panel was given a huge task: figure out what went so wrong. So today, we're going to unpack their findings and really get into the anatomy of these riots. Let's do it.
I mean, for 5 straight days, the images on the news were just shocking. You saw looting, arson, violence spreading from London to cities all across the country. We're talking about an estimated 15,000 people on the streets. Tragically, 5 people lost their lives, and hundreds more lost their homes and their businesses. This was a full-blown national crisis.
And the financial cost alone, it was just staggering. The panel estimated the total damage and all the associated costs came to over £500 million. That's a massive economic shock, on top of all the social trauma.
So, in the wake of all that destruction, the government set up the Riots, Communities, and Victims Panel. And their mission was pretty straightforward: answer 2 fundamental questions. First, why did this happen? And second, what on earth do we do to make sure it never ever happens again? Let's break down what they found.
Okay, so before you can even begin to understand the why, you've got to understand the who. So the first thing the panel did was build a really clear profile of the people who were actually involved.
And the scale here is just immense. This wasn't some small, isolated group of troublemakers. The panel estimated that somewhere between 13 and 15,000 people were actively out there involved in the riots. This was a huge, widespread event. So, what were people actually doing? Well, if you look at the data, a full half of all the crimes recorded were for things like burglary, robbery, or theft. The report is really clear that, for the most part, this was about opportunistic looting. People targeting shops full of TVs, phones, and other high-value goods.
Now, when the panel dug into the court data, a very specific profile started to emerge. They were young, 3/4 of them were 24 or younger, and overwhelmingly male. But here's where it gets really telling. The average person who was brought to court already had 11 previous convictions. And get this, a staggering 9 out of 10 of them were already known to the police.
And the data just keeps revealing these layers of deep disadvantage. A full 2/3 of the young people who rioted had special educational needs. Just think about that for a second. That's more than 3 times the national average. A huge, huge disparity.
And you see that same pattern of hardship when you look at the economics of it. 42% of the young rioters were eligible for free school meals, which is a key indicator of poverty. Now compare that to just 16% of students in England overall. It's a massive difference.
And this final statistic really brings it all home. 7 out of every 10 people who ended up in court for rioting came from the 30% most deprived postcodes in the entire country. The connection between poverty, lack of opportunity, and taking part in the riots was just undeniable.
Okay, so we have a pretty clear picture now of who was involved. But that just leads to the much bigger question, why? And the panel's analysis here is really insightful. They saw it not as one single cause, but as a combination of a spark and the fuel that had been piling up for years.
So the spark, that was the police shooting of a local man named Mark Duggan on August 4th. 2 days later, a peaceful protest outside the police station just descended into violence. And the speed of the escalation from there was, wow, it was unprecedented. Within 48 hours, it had spread right across London and then just went national, eventually hitting 66 different areas. And this is where that spark and fuel idea from the panel really helps make sense of it all. The spark? That was the immediate stuff. The police's poor communication with Mark Duggan's family and the community, plus all these rumors just spreading like wildfire on social media. But that spark landed on a whole pile of fuel that was ready to ignite. And what was that fuel? Well, it was things like a historic lack of trust in the police, a widespread feeling of having no stake in society, really high youth unemployment, and then, once the chaos started, just plain old opportunism.
And a key quote from the report really highlights how things went from a local issue to a national one. It says that once images started spreading on TV and social media, it created this perception that the police were totally overwhelmed, that they had lost control. And for a lot of people, that was basically a green light to get involved without any fear of consequence.
Now, understanding the causes was only half the battle. The panel's most important job was to create a blueprint, a plan, to stop this from ever happening again. And this wasn't about more riot shields or police tactics. It was about building a stronger, more resilient society.
The panel's chair, a guy named Dara Singh, he really got to the heart of the problem with this quote. He said the system was just full of gaps, and the most vulnerable people were falling right through them, from early childhood all the way to adulthood. The panel's recommendations were all designed to start plugging those gaps.
And they identified this key group that really needed attention, who they called the forgotten families. Now, this wasn't just the small number of troubled families that services usually focus on. This was a much, much larger group, around 500,000 families who are just sort of bumping along the bottom, really struggling, but getting fragmented, ineffective support.
So their plan was multifaceted. It started with providing real, joined-up support for those forgotten families. From there, it went to schools, focusing not just on academics, but on character and job skills. Making sure every single child could read and write was a huge priority. And finally, they called for reforming the justice system and, critically, rebuilding public trust in the police.
And you know, this wasn't just theory. The panel's work was really grounded in reality. As you can see here, they actually went out and visited 22 different areas. They talked to thousands of residents, business owners, and community leaders to really understand the problems and craft solutions that would actually work on the ground.
They even laid out what they called red lines, which are basically non-negotiable minimum standards for public services. Things like making sure no offender is ever released from prison without proper wraparound support, and guaranteeing a job or training for any young person who's been unemployed for over a year. You know, basic standards designed to give people a real chance.
At the end of the day, the entire report was about prevention. The panel's message was simple. You don't stop riots by just preparing for the next one. You stop them by building stronger, fair, and more hopeful communities, where people feel like they actually have a future that's worth protecting.
So the panel laid out this incredibly detailed blueprint all the way back in 2012. They identified the people, they identified the causes, and they laid out a really clear path forward. Which, of course, leaves us with one massive question. Over a decade later, have the lessons actually been learned?